Introduction. First of all, thanks to everyone for coming on today. A nice crowd developing for this Tuesday Lunch and Learn. I want to welcome and thank the co-sponsors of this program and the series, in fact, to our friends at Temple Beth David and Palm Beach Gardens, led ably by Rabbi Paul Arberman and Cantor Danielle Ben Simon, Beth David Congregation in Miami and their spiritual leader, Rabbi Cantor Julie Jacobs. I want to welcome and thank Linda Zisk, JTS Senior Director of Regions, our great friend, B'nai Torah member, Carolyn Cantor, who is the JTS Florida Region and the Director of Principal Gifts. And I also want to thank Tani Schwartz-Herman of JTS for her help in coordinating these and many other special JTS programs. I'll place some upcoming events in the chat over the course of this session, probably toward the end, but would like really everyone to note that the third and final session of this series will be on February 2nd, also at 12:15. The Hope in the Time of COVID series concludes with another very special teacher, Rabbi Gordon Tucker. And this coming Thursday at noon, not 12:15, but noon, a 3-session series with Dr. David Fishman of JTS begins. It's called Vilna, the Rise and Fall and Afterlife of the Jerusalem of Lithuania. And Dr. Fishman is another really wonderful teacher. We hope that you'll sign up for the new Scholar Stream series on navigating ethical dilemmas, also from JTS, and a partner program with the different arms of our conservative movement. That'll be on Tuesday evening, starting January 26th. That's late night learning, 8:00 p.m. Oh my goodness. But you got to sign up for that one in advance, and then you'll be emailed the link. We can't do it. We can do it for you if you let Zena know, but we really need you to sign up for that on your own. And of course, the Roots program continues tomorrow, the second session in that series. That's at 11:00 a.m. So that's out of the way. A brief but hopefully meaningful introduction to our very special guest teacher today. Now, unlike some of the recent arrivals to the JTS faculty, by which I mean those who started there in the last 20 years or so, I am privileged to have my own personal connection to and memories of learning with Rabbi Eliezer Diamond. He is an inspiration, mentor, teacher, and friend to many, including me. All who look to and look up to Rabbi Diamond admire and appreciate his intellect, spirit, insight, and intentionality that he brings to his teaching and to his life. He is well-versed and well-traveled in multiple Jewish worlds, eras, and approaches to Jewish scholarship at its highest levels, from the Beit Midrash to the hallowed halls of academia. I first got to know him when he became the scholar in residence at Camp Ramah in the Berkshires, then as a professor and rabbi at JTS. I'll say, tongue firmly planted in cheek, that he was even my congregant for about 5 minutes when I was a rabbinic intern at Town and Village Synagogue under the tutelage of our mutual friend, Rabbi Larry Siebert. This was before Rabbi Diamond made Aliyah to Teaneck, New Jersey. What is true, of course, is really the opposite. I will always be his student, and he will always be my rabbi, and I will look forward to each and every chance to hear what is on his mind, accompanied by his analysis, reflections, and perspective on text, life, love, and faith. And also, Dr. Eliezer Diamond is the Rabbi Judah Nadich Associate Professor of Talmud and Rabbinics at the Jewish Theological Seminary. He teaches courses in rabbinic literature and introductory, intermediate, and advanced Talmud studies. Dr. Diamond was ordained at the Rabbi Isaac Elchanan Theological Seminary of Yeshiva University and received his doctorate in Talmud from JTS. There will likely be time for questions in the middle and at the end of the program. Rabbi Diamond, it is always wonderful to see you, and welcome, at least virtually, to B'nai Torah.
Thank you very much, Rabbi Englander. So I would, give as long an introduction, but I think people do want to spend time studying. But I will say one thing, that one of my greatest values, one of the things that I value the most, is Menschlichkeit. And to me, among other things, Rabbi Englander is is a paragon in that regard. And it's not the only reason I hold him in high esteem, but that's definitely one of them. Okay, so I'll screen share in a moment, but as they say, before I begin talking, I'd like to say a few words. So this session is about both belief and about prayer. Prayer has been an extremely important part of my life, as has my relationship with God. And it's something that I think it would be good if we devoted more energy to these. That is, I was talking to someone yesterday that we teach our children many different subjects in school. And one which I wish we taught more is developing a spiritual discipline. Belief, prayer life, a life of observance don't just happen. They require training and thought. And I'm teaching now in that spirit, trying to help us think about how to be more mindful in our beliefs and our prayer, but also to acknowledge that there are significant problems with doing that. And so I want to address some of those, in particular when we feel abandoned, where we may have a relationship with God, and perhaps precisely because of that, we feel at certain points that we are abandoned. And I want to look at how our tradition responds to that. So let's start with the following question. How does one come to believe in God? So I would say part of the traditional answer is because our parents, our teachers, whoever it may be, tell us that God is out there. There's a famous proof, medieval proof, that God exists and that the Torah was given at Sinai. And basically, if you know, this is an old enough crowd to remember 50 million Frenchmen can't be wrong. So essentially, the argument is, if 600,000 people were at Sinai, or that's the claim, that claim could not have been sustained because someone, somewhere, or a group of people would have let us know that it's not true. So if we have this tradition from such a large group of people, it must be so. Okay, if that floats your boat, that's fine. But I think we live in a world where it's fair to say that in part because of science, we can pretty much explain how the world works without bringing God into the equation. But what we also can say is the why of existence is not something that science can explain to us. And that is really the realm of belief and religion. Okay, so how do we come to believe in God? So I've mentioned one reason, but for others, it starts with some intuition or maybe desire that there's something more, that there must be something beyond what we see in the world that we know. And traditionally, people like Heschel and Kugel, James Kugel, say that that's because God is there and God wants us to know God. And so it's as if someone is hinting to us, giving us signs of one's presence. And our task is to be aware of that and to act on it. And what does it mean to act on it? So I'm now going to start screen sharing. Oh, not that. Okay, screen. Okay, why is that happening? Okay, There we go. Everyone can see this, right? Okay. So I want to start with a statement by Martin Buber from a book of his, or essay, Two Types of Faith. And Buber says, right here, to be sure, he says before that, there are two, and in the end for him, two types of faith. To be sure, I'm reading here, there are very many contents of faith, but we only know faith itself in two basic forms. In other words, there's what we believe, but what is the nature of believing? Both can be understood from the simple data of our life. The one from the fact that I trust someone without being able to offer sufficient reasons for my trust in him or one. The other from the fact that likewise, without being able to give a sufficient reason, I acknowledge the thing to be true. So let's understand what Buber is saying here. There are different forms of belief, and for some people, the model is what I would call a relational model. We feel God's presence, and we want to be in relationship to that presence. And second model is that we feel that there must be a God, or we feel so strongly that there is a God that we feel the need to acknowledge that presence. And here's what's really important here. Heschel talks about a difference between belief that and belief in. That is, I can come to the conclusion based on my intuition, my experience, my thought, that God exists. But that could just be a fact. I don't necessarily act upon that fact. No, it's clear to me that the LA Dodgers are the best team in baseball. That by the way, that really is a fact. Take it from me. But let's say I say to someone else, you know, the Dodgers are the best team in baseball. The other person says, okay, but I'm a fan. So to me, that's an important fact. And it influences me that I watch the games, I care about whether they win or lose. Perhaps that's a trivial example. Maybe God wouldn't like this example, but okay. But here too, belief in means that once I experience God's presence, in whatever form that is true, it is transformative. That a question arises, now that I experience God's presence, what difference does that make in my life? How do I respond to that? And certainly in the Torah, God expects a response. That when God shows up, God is not just saying, by the way, I'm here. I want you to know that I'm here. God is saying to us, if you know that I'm here, that should affect your life. So for example, Genesis 12. Vayomer Adonai el Avram, lech lecha me'artzecha mimoladecha mibeit avicha el haaretz asher areka. This is the first time that we learn that God appears to Abram. And God appears asking of Abraham to really transform his life. God is not just saying, I'm here. God is saying, I'm here, and I'm here and calling upon you to do something. And by the way, I'm calling upon you to do something where you don't know how it will end. I'm asking you to move from your fixed place and to travel, not knowing exactly where that journey will take you. And as far as that goes, you're entering into a relationship of trust with me. You are trusting that what I am asking of you is important and good. So this is part of what it means, a big part of what it means to believe in God. I also want to say something about being an agnostic. I was once speaking and someone said to me, you know, Rabbi, I'm an agnostic, and that's the Jewish way of life, isn't it? So I said, well, the first thing I'm going to say is, to the best of my knowledge, agnosticism is not one of the 613 commandments. So there may be many Jews who are agnostic, and that's fine. But is it the Jewish way? I'm not sure what that means. But then I said, it's important to know that there are two kinds of Jewish agnostics. One is a person who says, if God exists, God knows my address, my phone number, my email, let God get in touch. In the meantime, I'm not seeing it. And then there's a second kind of agnostic who says, well, I don't know. I don't know if God exists. And that reminds me that I am a not knowing being. This is a very important truth about us as human beings. We are ultimately not knowing beings. There is so much that we do not know, as much as we may know. And so if I'm that second kind of agnostic, I say, I do not know. And that's because I am not a inherently knowing being. And therefore, I am going to set out to know more. I am open to discovering the presence of God. I may not experience it right now, and I may never experience it. But I'm not just going to sit in one place and say it's up to God to let me know that God is present. It's also up to me to seek out that presence. Now, let's say that I do have a relationship with God. For myself, by the way, I never say I believe in God. I say I experience God's presence, because that's what counts for me, the sense that God is present and that I have a relationship. So let's say I believe in God and God is present, but that presence is complicated. So for example, when we look at Exodus 33, this is Moshe with God. The people have sinned with the golden calf, and Moshe has ascended the mount once again to seek forgiveness for the people. But Moshe wants more than that. Moshe wants a certain kind of intimacy with God. And so he says to God, oh, let me behold your presence. Hareini na et kvodecha. I want to know you. I want to be really close to you. And God answers, I will cause all my goodness to pass before you, and I will proclaim before you the name Lord, and the grace that I grant and the compassion that I show. But, he said, you cannot see my face. For man, human beings, may not see me and live. And so God is telling Moshe, as much as I can be present in the world, as much as you and I can have a relationship, ultimately, there is a part of me that you will never know, that you cannot know. And I would say, why? Because we're just different kinds of beings. We cannot understand God, who is so radically different from what we are, who we are. And by the way, I'm just going to say something now. It's a little bit of an aside, but it's an important point to me, maybe for this conversation. I also believe that God can't understand us totally, because God's not a human being. I don't know that God can totally get what it means to be human. And, you know, part of what happens in the Torah is that God begins to see that. You know, God decides to destroy the world with a flood. And afterwards, he said, you know, I'm seeing what these human beings are like. And I guess I have to make peace with that. And so I'm not going to destroy the world again. As frustrated as I get with these people, I'm not going to destroy the world again. So God is not totally knowable. But there's more than that. God sometimes intentionally, God sometimes seems not to be present, and God tells us that that's going to happen. But, right? We're looking now at Deuteronomy 31. And the Lord says to Moses, "You are soon to lie with your fathers. This people will thereupon go astray after the alien gods in their midst, in the land that they are about to enter. They will forsake me and break my covenant that I made with them." I have to say, I'm not sure why God thought that was a good thing to tell Moshe, but okay. "Then my anger will flare up against them, and I will abandon them and hide my countenance from them. They shall be ready prey, and many evils and troubles shall befall them. And they shall say on that day, surely it is because our God is not within our midst that these evils have befallen us. Yet I will keep my countenance hidden on that day because of all the evil that they have done in turning to other gods." I think this is a very complicated passage here, in that first God describes God's self as abandoning us in times when God is angry with us. But then the people are described as saying, surely it is because God is not in our midst that these evils have befallen us, which seems to be something different, which is that because God has abandoned the people, has hidden God's face, as it were, the people come to the conclusion that God is not present at all. God is not in our midst. They do not understand that there are moments of the hiding of God's face. But those moments of God's hiddenness do not mean that God is totally absent, that God has disappeared. It means that God is responding to our behavior. And let's face it, we have that in human relationships too. Someone hurts us very deeply, and we don't give up on that relationship, but we need time to heal. And sometimes that means spending time away from that person. I don't know if anyone here has ever had a disagreement or a fight with a spouse, but I can say that that has happened to me personally. And sometimes in the course of that argument or disagreement, one or the other of us says, we'll make up, but right now I'm turning away from you. I cannot in this moment be in a relationship with you. So the Torah tells us that that happens. And if we're going to believe in God, then we have to accept that this is part of what happens. Okay, so far so good. But here's one of the problems. Sometimes we may feel that we understand God's turning away. Understand because I did this, because I did that. In a sense, I deserve God's turning away in that moment. However, very often we experience God's absence in some shape or form. And we think that it is unfair, it's uncalled for. Let's go back to Ellington's book. No, wrong, sorry, getting the wrong book. This comes from a book by Scott Ellington called Risking Truth, Reshaping the World Through Prayers of Lament. It's a wonderful, wonderful book. It's a book that tries to understand the mindset of the psalmist or the psalmists. And the basic thesis of the book is what we have in Psalms, which is almost totally absent in our Siddur, and I don't know if you've ever thought about this, is complaint and accusation. There are so many Psalms when the psalmist says to God, "Where are you? You've abandoned me. You've left me to suffer." And what Ellington says is that this lament accusation is a deep act, reflects a deep belief. Because one would never make such a statement if one believed that God were not there. If God's not there, why would I waste the time? And if I didn't believe that there is the possibility of God responding to my prayer, to my lament, I also wouldn't bother. So, as the title says, risking truth, the psalmist is taking a chance. The psalmist is saying, ultimately, I believe that you are present, God. And ultimately, I believe that I will experience it. But I've got to say, it's not happening right now. And he says, we'll just read what he says here. Prayers of lament arise from experiences of loss. To hear a diagnosis of cancer, to be permanently disabled in an automobile accident, to be fired from a job, to be betrayed by a spouse, or to lose everything and be forced to live in the streets are all experiences that overturn our world. They threaten to rob us of our sense of security, of the goodness of life, and of the justice of God. They can strip us of our dignity and can plant in our hearts the conviction that we have been betrayed by our own frailties, by those around us, and most importantly, by God. In the context of biblical prayers of lament, God is the particular problem. In the midst of crisis, fervent prayers crying out to God and seeking God's deliverance are met with divine silence. At the heart of biblical laments are the twin experiences of profound loss and the silence of God. It's a double suffering, the suffering itself and the absence of a comforting God. And by the way, this is particularly poignant because we have to understand it in the context of the covenantal model. Right? The Torah speaks of our having a covenant with God, not a partnership, not a contract, but a covenant. Contracts, let's say partnerships, are basically based on self-interest. I go into business with you because I think it's going to be good for me too. A covenant is committing oneself to something beyond the self. And that's what we are meant to do. And that is what God promises to do in return. So when God is not present in our lives, we, among other things, say to God, what happened to the covenant? Why are you not honoring that relationship that the covenant requires of you? It may require things of us, but it also requires things of you. And we see you as being guilty of non-performance, not fulfilling your part of the covenant. So it's 12:44 now. I'm just wondering if there are any questions or comments that people want to raise or have raised. I think they're being addressed to Rabbi Englander.
Do you want to stop your screen share for just a moment so I can see other folks?
Absolutely. Yeah. Okay, so Rabbi Englander, you're muted. Did you want to say something?
If folks want to put themselves on gallery view for a moment, they can. Does anybody have any questions that they'd like to articulate? There's one in the chat that I think is a pretty big one. You can confirm, deny, accept, or decline it.
He led us to a certain way of thinking about God that turned God into a concept rather than a living presence. And once you do that, and once you say, you get into the questions of, well, God is all-knowing. How could God not know something? God is all-powerful. How could God not be totally powerful, apparently, in this particular case? Maybe I'm sort of skirting the issue here, But to me, the most attractive way of thinking about God is the biblical God. And the biblical God is a complicated being. That God does not always seem to understand things. God gets input from Moshe and from others, and occasionally says, good point. Okay, we have to go in a different direction. Is that God all powerful? Yes, in a way, but it's also clear, and we saw that just before with the idea of the hiding of the face, that God apparently chooses at times not to use that power. We can ask why, and I don't know the answer to that one, but I accept that that's part of the relationship. To put it another way, and if people don't want to accept this, I get it. But for me, my relationship with God is in some important ways like my relationships with people. I expect to be disappointed now and then. Why? I can't explain it. And also I cannot justify it. Okay. I don't believe that I'm supposed to cover for God. Say, oh, there's a reason and this must be it. I don't get it. But for me, I never want not to have the relationship. And my relationship with God is a dynamic one. Some days it's great, some days it's not so good. But the basic question for me is, do I want to stay committed to the relationship? And my answer is yes. At the end, I'm going to share something of a personal nature, which I think will illustrate this. Because when I teach, I only like to teach things where I can say I walk the walk, not just talk the talk. All right, so let's go back to our screen share. And let's note that in a prayer that we're all familiar with, which is the Kiddusha of the Shabbat Musaf, this paradox that God is present and yet also hidden is expressed. So in the second part of the Kiddusha, we quote Isaiah, holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. I could say it in Hebrew, we all know it, I'm assuming. Kadosh, 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 Adonai Tzvaot, Melo Chol Haaretz Kodo. The whole world is filled with God's presence. And yet, what do we read next? God's glory fills the universe. In response, God's servants ask of each other, where is the place of God's glory? In response to the first chorus of angels, another band of angels says, Baruch Kivod Adonai Mimkomo. And the way this verse is being understood by the rabbis is, on the one hand, God is totally present. On the other hand, there is a sense in which God is somewhere. And we bless God without fully knowing where that somewhere is. And brilliantly, the rabbis, based on that verse, now say, Mim komo, right, starting with the last word of the verse, that's a verse from Ezekiel, Mim komo hu yifen barachamim, which really, I think, reflects a sense of distance from God and maybe even a sense of God's hiddenness. So God is, wherever God is, we ask that God turn from that place, turn God's face, v'yachon amam yachadim shemo, and show favor to God's people. And by the way, I want to emphasize this image. It's a very powerful image, the image of the face, an image of the light of the face. The way we connect with people is we turn our faces to them. And the way that we give them of ourselves is that we share with the light of our faces. And that's what we ask of God. We ask to be illuminated by God's presence, but we don't always experience that. And that's what the Kedusha is saying. Yes, perhaps the world is filled with God's glory, but that's not always our experience. Okay. So now let's talk about what happens when we feel that God is not present. And let me see if I... Okay. Do I have to go back? Yeah, I have to go back. Sorry, give me a moment here. Yeah. So let's just look at the Psalms, and let's look at two instances. I'm circling back a little bit here, but let's look at two instances where the psalmist doesn't pull any punches. Right? The psalmist says in Psalm 44, "It is for your sake that we are slain all day long, that we are regarded as sheep to be slaughtered." And now an amazing verse. "Rouse yourself. Why do you sleep? You seem to be asleep at the real God. Awaken, do not reject us forever. Why do you hide your face, ignoring our affliction and distress?" That's what we are experiencing right now. And another psalm, the next psalm, Psalm 22. No, Psalm 23 is much more positive. Begins with a very famous verse. Eli, Eli, lama azabtani, rachok mishuati, divrei shagati. My God, why have you abandoned me? Why so far from delivering me and from my anguish? What happened there? Roaring. Okay, bait got in there by mistake. My anguish roaring. So in general, the response of the psalmist to God's absence is to sort of grab God and to say, you should be here and you're not. You are betraying me. But there's another response to the sense of God's absence. And that is that we ourselves turn away in some sense. That we're hurt by God. And we just said before, sometimes when we are in a relationship and we have been hurt and we feel that that person has turned away, we turn away in return. And I'm going to give you a biblical example of that and then look at some rabbinic examples of that. So getting the wrong thing. So the biblical example is from the book of Samuel. So if you remember, David is told by the prophet Nathan, because Bathsheba has become pregnant by you through an adulterous relationship, the child with which she is pregnant will die. And the child is born. We're told in 2 Samuel chapter 12, David entreated God for the boy. David fasted and he went in and spent the night lying on the ground. The senior servants of his household tried to induce him to get up from the ground, but he refused, nor would he partake of food with them. On the seventh day, the child died. David's servants were afraid to tell David that the child was dead, for they said, "We spoke to him when the child was alive and he wouldn't listen to us. How can we tell him that the child is dead? He might do something terrible." When David saw his servants talking in whispers, David understood that the child was dead. David asked his servants, "Is the child dead?" "Yes," they replied. Now look at David's response to this. Thereupon David rose from the ground, bathed and anointed himself, which is exactly the opposite of what already biblically, the opposite of what one would do in mourning, as is true today. And he changed his clothes, went into the house of the Lord and prostrated himself. Then he went home, he asked for food, which they set before him, and he ate. Again, contrary to mourning practices that are described in some instances in the Bible, that part of mourning is fasting. So his courtiers asked him, "Why have you acted in this manner? When the child was alive, you fasted and wept. But now that the child is dead, you rise and take food? Why isn't your your sadness, your mourning greater. What's David's response? He replied, while the child was still alive, I fasted and wept because I thought, who knows? The Lord may have pity on me, and the child may live. Now that he is dead, why should I fast? Can I bring him back again? I shall go to him, but he will never come back to me. Now, there are various ways that commentators understand these verses, but here's the interpretation that I'm going to suggest to you. David says, I asked God for one thing. I asked God to keep my child alive. And God said no. And once God said that, I am not willing to be hurt anymore. I am not willing to cry out, to mourn, because that's it. God said no. Well, then I'm moving on. God cannot expect me to be hurt anymore. And I think that there's an example of that in our Kaddish. Right? The so-called Kaddish Shalem, the full Kaddish, contains a paragraph, Titkabal Sloton Uvoton D'chol Yisrael, let the prayers of Israel be accepted. The Kaddish Yatom, the mourner's Kaddish, does not contain that paragraph. Why not? I think one of the ways of understanding this is that the mourner says, like David, I had one prayer, and my prayer is that this person, this beloved person, not die. And that prayer has not been answered. So God, don't expect me to stand here and entreat you now in this moment when you have taken away the person I love. I'm not going to do that. I will say the Kaddish, I will magnify your name, but I will not make myself vulnerable in this way. That is asking too much of me. Now, this idea that I can turn away from God, so what I want to explain here is there's sort of two ways of challenging God when we feel abandoned by God. One is the psalmist's way is to challenge God, to speak to God and to say to God, you have turned away. You should not have turned away. Why did you do that? Turn back. And the other kind of responding to God's abandonment is to say, in effect, that's the way it is. You're turning away from me. Well, in this moment, I'm going to turn away from you. That's my response. And this idea of a turning away is expressed in a very interesting passage in the Talmud. I'm not going to go through the whole passage because it's a rather long one and an intricate one, but let me sort of set the scene. The rabbis believed that our prayers were composed by the Anshe Knesset Hagdolah, the men of the Great Assembly, which was this purported body of elders that existed at the beginning of the Second Temple period. Because remember, for the rabbis, the beginning of the Second Temple period is a very transformative moment and a moment of great transition. We are moving from the time that we know God through prophecy, that we have people in our midst who are prophets to whom God actually speaks, and that's how we know God's will, to a time when, for the rabbis at least, prophets seek to exist. So now how do we know God? We know God through God's texts, by studying the texts that God has given us, starting, of course, with the 5 books of the Torah. That's the way that we can now know God. And so now The people who know God best are not prophets, but scholars. The people who can divine, if you allow me to use that word, God's will through the study of Torah. So these Anshe Knesset Agdolah, these men of the great assembly, according to this rabbinic tradition, compose prayer. And how does and prayer, when we say prayer here, we primarily mean the Amidah. And how does the Amidah begin? Baruch atah Hashem, Elokeinu v'Elokei Avotenu, Elokei Avraham, Elokei Yitzchak, Elokei Yaakov. And now for many of us also matriarchs, but in any case, first it speaks of God as being the God of our ancestors. And then we have a description of God's attributes. Hakel, Hagadol, Hagibor, Vahanora. Right? God who is great, mighty, and awesome. Where does that description come from? Moshe addresses God in that way. Moshe describes God in exactly that fashion. So the idea seems to be, how can we describe God since we don't really know who and what God is? And the answer of those who composed the prayers was to say, well, who do we know who knows God best or who knew God best? Moses. So we're going to take Moses' description of God and we're going to put that at the beginning of the Amidah. So now what happens? The history of this phrase is as follows. So Moses described God as Hakel, Hagadol, Hagibor, Vahanora. We have two books in which people pray to God, but they leave out one of God's attributes, one of these attributes. Yirmiyahu, the prophet Jeremiah, prays to God, and he describes God as Hakel, Hagadol, Hagibor. God is great and mighty, doesn't mention awesome. Daniel prays to God and says, Hakel, Hagadol, Vahanora. God is great and awesome, doesn't mention mighty. The rabbis suggest that these were conscious protests. Jeremiah was praying at a time that the temple was being destroyed. And so Jeremiah was saying to God, you claim to be awesome. If you're so awesome, how come the temple is being destroyed? How come your people are being exiled? I can't in good conscience describe you as awesome. And Daniel says, your people are living in exile. You want me to tell you to describe you as mighty? A mighty God would not allow us to remain in exile. So I cannot in good conscience describe you as mighty. The Talmud goes on to say, and let's get the timeline here, right? Moses, early on, Jeremiah at the end of the first temple period, Daniel during the Babylonian exile. Now the Babylonian exile is over, the people return, and the Anshe Knesset HaGedolah are formulating prayer, and they include the whole phrase. And they say, in effect, to Daniel and Jeremiah, you may not see that God is mighty or that God is awesome, but God is. And if you don't experience God as being mighty or awesome, that's on you. You, for whatever reason, fail to understand. You don't know God. You don't know God well enough to see that God always is those things. And they go and basically give a midrash to show that, yes, even in the moment of the temple's destruction, God is awesome, because if not only would the temple have been destroyed, but the people would have been destroyed. Okay, they answer what they answer. But now something interesting happens at the very end of the passage. So that the rabbis at the end of the passage ask a question. They say, and the rabbis, Jeremiah and Daniel here, get retroactive ordination. So they say, and the rabbis, meaning Jeremiah and Daniel, how could they do this and uproot an ordinance instituted by Moses? They're regarding Moses' statement not just as a description, but Moses prescribing to us how we should describe God. So how could these prophets decide on their own not to describe God as Moses did. Rabbi Eliezer said, they did so because they knew of the Holy One, blessed be he, that he is truthful and hates a lie. Consequently, they did not speak falsely about him. Since they did not perceive his attributes of might and awesomeness, they did not refer to them. Therefore, they cannot be criticized for doing so. So what's going on here? On the one hand, the passage tells us that the men of the great assembly are telling Daniel and Jeremiah, and therefore really all of us, right? We all understand that the story is not about just Daniel and Jeremiah. It's about all of us, right? We all have moments where we're not seeing it. Really, there's a mighty God out there. We're not seeing it. In part, in moments when we feel abandoned. So first, the Talmud tells us, you may not see it, but those are the words of prayer, and you must say them, even not seeing them. The anthropologist Roy Rappaport says, maybe that's the greatest act of faith that is out there, saying words that we don't totally believe. So that's one part of the story. But then the Talmud also says, as individuals, God wants us to tell our truth. So the way I understand this passage is, when I pray as two different people. I pray as a member of the praying community of Israel. And in that moment, in the moment of public prayer, I need to be ready to exercise a certain degree of humility, perhaps we will call it, and also identification with our community. And to say, I have to say, I don't really experience the truth of these words, but I say them, I pray them as a form of identifying with and being part of the praying community of Israel. But you know, after the Amidah, there's a practice of saying, Elokai nitzor lushoni me'ra. God, guard my lips from speaking evil. Now, this is not part of the Amidah proper. It was the personal prayer of one of the rabbis, Mar Bar Rabina. And there's a certain sad irony, which is, why was that included? It was included to tell us that after the formal prayer of the community, there is a space for us to offer our own prayers. Unfortunately, the way we've ended up doing that is by all of us saying the same personal prayer, which means it's not personal at all. So what I invite you to do, because I invite myself to do this, and I think that this is what this passage in the Talmud invites us to do, is to pray the prayer of the community, to pray the Amidah. And then when I'm finished, to say to God, and now, here are a few words from me. I've said the prayers. I've been part of the community. But I have to tell you, God, I'm not seeing it. I do not experience you that way. I'm angry at you. I feel abandoned by you. And you have to hear it. And a God of truth is willing to hear that. So I know that's me. That's my perception in this moment, but it is my truth in this moment. And we should all make a space for ourselves to have that moment in prayer, to have that moment of talking about, expressing our own pain and anger. So I'm going to conclude, and then people can ask questions after this. My understanding is that at 1:15 is going to be Q&A. If there are questions, I'm happy to answer them. I want to tell you a personal story. You know, I'm a little bit at the risk of TMI here, but I think it's important to tell the story. So I am facing a significant health challenge. And I have been able to deal with it, for the most part, with great equanimity. as I've said to many people, turns out that having a spiritual life can come in handy. Who knew? And that really has helped me. But there was a period not that long ago where this whole other health issue arose that's probably not connected to the first one, which among other things involved certain procedures, which I'll just say I found very degrading. And you know how a cup is filled to the brim and then you pour a little bit more into it and it overflows? That was the experience that I had. Like, come on. I have this. Okay, I'm dealing. And now you're giving me this? And I was furious at God. And the way it started was I put on my talit and tefillin and nothing came. Nothing came. I could not say the words of prayer. I could not. I did not. Because I was, and along the lines of what I just described, I was so angry at God that I think basically what I felt was, you really expect me to get up there and praise you and talk about how wonderful you are? It ain't happening. And then at a certain moment, I was so angry and I was expressing it. And I came to a moment where I was about to say something that I would describe as being blasphemous. And I suddenly stopped myself. And I said, no, I'm not going to say that. And the reason I didn't say it is the same reason that in our relationships with people, if we're smart, sometimes out of anger, we'll say certain things, but then we come to a moment where we know if we say this, we probably will harm the relationship irreparably. And what I felt in that moment was, I can be as angry as I want to be, but I need God in my life. And I think that God wants to be in my life. And I don't want to destroy that relationship. I don't want to do something that will irreparably harm it. And I was able to step back from that moment. And I even had another thought, which was, I'm really having a hard year. But God probably is also. God looks down at our world and sees what a mess it is. That may or may not work for you. Didn't work for me entirely either, but that was the thought. So I want to share that with you because for many reasons, but mainly because our relationship with God is complicated, and it's okay for it to be complicated. It's okay for us to have ups and downs in the relationship. It's okay to call out God. Because if I have a robust relationship, the relationship will survive those moments. And according to the Talmud, God wants that. God does not want us to be false or hypocritical. The very act of calling out to God, and that's what Ellington explained, is a way of affirming the relationship. You don't call out to someone who's not there. You call out to someone who is there. And you say, I want a repair. I want a healing. Sometimes it comes sooner. Sometimes it comes later. And listen, I'm going to be realistic. For some of us, it never comes. But I hope that when you reach that moment of anger and disappointment and the sense of God's abandonment, that you don't just turn away. That you have enough investment in the relationship to find ways of keeping it going, including getting angry. Sometimes that's the way you keep it going. So that's my story, sticking to it. And now, if people have questions or comments, I'm happy to hear that. And let me actually say one more thing. This is me. I mean, I've also taught some sources, but I've also talked about my relationship. I'm not in any way telling people, That's what your relationship should be. It's complicated. You'll have different relationships. But I hope that this has been useful no matter what your relationship is. Okay.
I have a question.
Can you stop your screen share?
Yeah, sure. Sorry. Yeah.
I have a question. How do you tie this in with hope in the time of COVID? That's what the seminar was quote titled disengaging, demanding or disengaging, feeling abandoned by God. How do you, maybe I missed this, but because I wasn't here for the first 5 minutes, but how do you?
Fair enough. So let me make the connection explicit. We're living in a time of plague. We're living in a time where one might say to oneself, if there's a God up above, is it really okay that this is what's happening in our world, that people are sick and dying? And one of the things that I'm saying is that we have a choice in relating to that. And for some people, the conclusion will be, this is yet more evidence that there's, no one's driving the bus. We live in a random world. Viruses don't look at people and say, you're good, you're bad. They just want to survive. And in the process of doing so, they bring sickness and death. Or we can be angry that this is what's happening in our world and say, yes, and I don't think it's fair. I can't understand that there is any reason why it should be true. But I believe that there is good in the world and that I can bring good into the world. And whatever problems I have with God, I think that the relationship that I have with God calls me to action. It calls me to goodness. And so the relationship that I choose to have personally is to do good, including combating the virus in whatever way is possible, or giving hope or comfort or help to those people who are affected by it. So my relationship with God is very much a part of how I am experiencing this and how I'm reacting to it. And that's something I put out there and offer, and then we each have to make a decision how we're going to react.
Bill, you want to unmute?
Yes.
You're on mute.
I'm unmuted. I agree with everything. I love everything you said. It gives me some great pleasure to understand better. But sometimes the Torah and the Talmud says things that just drives me crazy. The first one being the Deuteronomy 31:18, when it says that God's destroying it because, quote, the evil they have done. And that course can be translated to anything that happens, and the reason it happens is because the evil that's been done, be it the Holocaust, be it a child dying, and that's troublesome. Talmud-wise, the story of, and I won't say the whole story, but basically of the rabbi who's sick, and he's brought by a friend rabbi comes and he says, well, you must have done something wrong, or you must have not studied enough, or maybe just God loves you a lot. Such uncomfortable answers that doesn't come to the same conclusion that you did. Help me out.
So I can only help you out partially because I can't help you out more than I can help myself out on this. It bothers me also. But I will tell, but before I return to that, or maybe I should return to it. Honestly, in some ways, I would argue that there is, to my mind, a kind of almost pathological thought process, and this has been true throughout Jewish history, which is for some people, when suffering comes, they say it must be because we've sinned and God is punishing us. Because that gives greater comfort to them than saying God is absent. Because at least we know God is present if God is punishing us. God may not be present in the way that we want, but at least we know, right? The punishment itself tells us that God is there. All I can say, if that floats your boat, be my guest. Certainly does not float mine. And frankly, with those passages, and maybe this is a cop-out, but I simply profess a lack of understanding. And I certainly profess an unwillingness to say, oh, I know why it's happening. Because yes, it leads to blasphemous statements, like the Holocaust happened because fill in the blank. But you also need to know, we also need to know that this is not the only voice, neither in the Bible nor in rabbinic literature. There is a passage at the end of Tractate Moed Katan where it's explained, if you die at this age, it's because you did sin X. And if you die at that age, it's because you did sin Y. And then the Rabbi Rava comes along and says, you know what? How long you live, what your financial situation is in life, how many children you have, and what your experience with them is, it's the luck of the draw. Okay? It's not because you're good, it's not because you're bad. It happens. And he talks about two rabbis, and he says they were equally pious, and one was wealthy and had children and everything was great, and the other lived a life of suffering. And in fact, he's challenging those around him to say, are you going to tell me that this rabbi suffered for some good reason? So basically what Rava is saying, and he's not the only rabbi to say this, there's an article that shows that in the anonymous layer of the Talmud, that this is a widespread attitude, which is, we don't get it, and we're not willing to get it. We do not see fairness in the world in which we live. And as I said before, we're not willing to cover for God. Yes, we can't understand fully. I don't know, maybe someday in the world to come, it will become clear. But I'm not in the world to come. We're not in the world to come. We're in this world. And in this world, we have the right, and the Talmud says, the obligation to say, this does not make sense to me. In my experience, this is unfair. And I still choose not to turn away from God in light of that. Those can be very difficult things to hold those two at the same time. It's a choice. That's the choice that I make. And there's nothing heretical, is really my point, about saying, I choose not to simply explain everything that happens as just because, God must have a good reason for it. Maybe God does, but we're not seeing it.
Jennifer?
Thanks. I'm gaining so much. And of course, I know we all as a community and all your friends and family wish you the best return to the best of health and all the serenity that comes with it. I have a question. The Torah sets you up to believe that, if you're bad, you're going to get punished. I mean, you could open any page of the Torah, probably drop your finger, and there's a passage. And for the most minute things, right? And all of a sudden they're dead. And so what I wondered is, I grapple with that myself, thinking, if I'm just good and I just, pray at the right time, all heartfelt though, never just to rattle off that, then bad things won't happen it's more the people I love, actually. And then of course things happen, and then, the veil drops yet again. So I don't know what, I just wondered, how everybody and Rabbi Diamond, your words were wonderful, and to continue believing in God, but I guess it's just that strength of character that lives with that sword of Damocles over our heads and just, lives life to the fullest. I just don't know.
Yeah.
I don't
Again,
know what the question.
I don't have a magic answer, but to the extent that I have an answer, I'll tell you what it is. First of all, I believe in Midrash. I do not feel chained to the literal meaning of Tanakh, the biblical text. And I also, and the rabbis, I think you can see de facto, sometimes in effect, legislated statements in the Tanakh that were difficult for them, legislated them out of existence. So if you do it or I do it, we're not the first people to do it. But I believe two things. One is, and this is the way I read most of those statements. I don't know about I got sick because I did something. But the way I read those verses is actions have consequences. I don't believe that the consequence is or should be, sickness or a safe falling on your head or whatever. But it is important. The lesson that I take away from those passages is I should not fool myself into thinking when I sin, when I betray someone else, that there are no consequences. The Torah tells us again and again, there are, and know that. The second thing I will say is, there's an aspect of God that I think is very present in our tradition that is so rarely emphasized and taught. And that is, God loves us. Once I said this when I was teaching in the synagogue, and someone got up very angrily and says, I don't want to hear Christianity taught here. Very sad moment. But God loves us. The rabbis say, every person is obligated to say, Bishvili nivra ha'olam. The world was created for me, which doesn't mean it was created for me and not you. It means that each of us is loved, and in part, the evidence for that is that we were given the gift of life. And if we would love each other, and I say this especially as a parent, with our children, if we would give people, and especially our children, a very clear message that we love them unconditionally. We may be hurt by them. We may be disappointed. I don't like to use that word. But we love them unconditionally. I once got my kids together and I said, I'm telling you something now that you need to know. No matter what you do, I will always love you. And I believe that we should be devoting so much more energy in our Jewish institutions, in our Jewish schools, to telling our children that. And that is a very important part of our tradition. And different people emphasize different parts of our tradition. For me, that's an underemphasized part, and one that I think is healing and empowering and true, or should be true.
Our
So that's
time
what
with
I
Rabbi Diamond has come to a
Thank you.
conclusion.
Thank you.
And we're just really appreciative, as always, your presentation's human and relatable, but also profound and very provocative of a lot more thought too. So Rabbi, we're appreciative. Thanks so much for being with us. I hope folks will look at the chat. We join your students and your colleagues in wishing Refuah Shlema, Rabbi. May it come quickly and